coming to hear a fall practicum presentation with a great group as always, and they're working on this project related to sea level rise and climate change, and I was thinking, yeah, they've really, literally, been down in the muck and the mud and the marshes, looking at all these different public finance and grant issues and programs, and fortunately they've been able to kind of pull themselves out of the muck and come to some interesting suggestions for project planners in San Mateo County, and we'll look forward to hearing from you guys, and then doing some Q&A. So go right ahead.
All right, thanks, Larry, and welcome everybody. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to thank you all for being here today as we present some of our findings regarding payment options for a future climate change mitigation effort in Mateo County. After we introduce our team and our project focus and outcomes, the agenda for today is to actually share with you guys some of the specific funding and financing categories that we uncovered throughout our research, as well as introducing you to some of the exact project types that we think San Mateo County could implement in their territory using those funding and financing mechanisms. Next, we'll explain our scoring methodology, or how we decided to rank what criteria points we focused on while ranking the options for the county in terms of most desirable, least desirable. And then we'll actually apply that methodology to a couple sample project ratings so you guys can see how that process played out before finally getting into our recommendations, conclusions, and findings that we have been kind of logging and accumulating throughout the quarter. So without further ado, my name is Roberto. I've been in classes with several of you throughout my years here, but I am obviously public policy major focusing in advanced policy analysis.
Marx, been in a few of your classes as well, focusing on advanced policy analysis as well.
My name is Chelsea House. My policy focus is healthcare.
My name is Peter Litzow. My policy focus is growth and development policies.
Jacqueline, Wibowo. My focus is science and technology policy.
Yeah, and then in addition, obviously, to the five of us up here, we have our sixth team member, Professor Larry Litvack, who just graciously introduced us. So we'd like to thank Professor Litzow for all of his for all of his guidance, counseling, and for overseeing our daily class meetings. So the effects and the threats of climate change are already quite prevalent in San Mateo County. In fact, San Mateo County is one of the most vulnerable areas in California to extreme flooding as a result of sea level rise and extreme rainfall events. If left unchecked and unmanaged, the potential consequences from these climate change phenomena I just mentioned could be serious in terms of life, risks to life, health, infrastructure, and the economy in the surrounding area. Preventative action is paramount because if nothing is done, the short-term damages of flood, and these numbers are in terms of the value of property parcels in the area, that doesn't even consider potential economic loss for having critical infrastructure being out of commission for an extended period of time. But the short-term damages could reach up to $1 billion, while long-term damages could balloon to almost $40 billion. One of the first things that our team did when we started our background research was to read San Mateo County's vulnerability report. And within that report, there's a specific recommendation for the county to begin identifying and evaluating funding and financing mechanisms, as well as specific project types that can be used in their area to hopefully mitigate some of these damages. And that's really where our team's involvement was. We've been kind of considering this exercise as really counseling and advising the county on how they can start to address the issue of climate change as it pertains to sea level rise and extreme rainfall events in their county. And so this is actually much trickier than it may seem. It's quite difficult to get funding and financing for climate change adaptation projects, especially in the pre-disaster phases. And a lot of this, we think, is due to the fact that the main, or the bulk of the benefits of these types of projects won't be fully realized for several years, and in some cases several decades to come. And before I pass over to Chelsea, who will tell you guys a little bit more about our project outcomes, I'd like to briefly clarify the difference between funding and financing, because you'll hear all of us kind of refer to those terms throughout the presentation. So a funding mechanism is a stream of revenue that the county could use to pay for projects on a rolling basis, so pay as you go, and it does not need to be reimbursed or in any way returned to the original source. Now, a financing mechanism is one that you would use a funding mechanism to borrow, use the funding mechanism to borrow against and start, borrowing the money and would need to repay at some point later in time, like a bond or a loan. So, pass it over to Chelsea now.
So now I'll discuss more about the outcomes that we created for our report. So in response to the request from the county, we created 5 different deliverables that can be used as resources for project planning. The first is a funding compendium, which is essentially just an Excel spreadsheet listing all the funding and financing sources that we researched with key descriptors for each of those sources. The second is a rating matrices for the planning, construction, and operation management phases of 3 projects typical for addressing sea level rise and extreme rain events. So there are a total of 9 matrices, which are Excel spreadsheets listing the most promising funding and financing sources for each project at the given phase. Sources are included in these spreadsheets if they fit minimum requirements as determined by a rating system that we created, which evaluates the source against a set of criteria. And the criteria are things we deem to be the most important considerations when deciding on any funding or financing source. The third deliverable we created is an application of our rating system for 2 projects, the Pescadero Resiliency Project for the construction phase and the Plan Princeton Project for the planning phase. Finally, we made 2 sets of recommendations. Our first set of recommendations is geared towards project planners and discuss general funding and financing trends that we gathered through our research. While our second set of recommendations are geared towards policymakers, and these recommendations discuss future policy suggestions and changes that should be prioritized in order to optimize funding and financing acquisition. And if you look to the slide, the items that are bolded are the ones that we'll discuss in detail during our presentation today.
Yeah, so we began our research by analyzing a wide variety of funding sources and financing mechanisms, some that were specific to climate change and resilient infrastructure, and a lot that weren't. We decided to whittle down our final analysis to the sources that are categorized on this slide, which includes both pure funding sources as well as funding sources that have opportunities for financing on top of it. So to give you a more deeper dive into this, within the pure funding sources, to reiterate what Justin said earlier, pure funding sources represent a stream of revenue that can be used on a pay-as-you-go basis to fund different project expenditures. So we looked at federal, state, and local grant opportunities which project leaders and policymakers can apply to receive funding for a specific project. That includes the NOAA Coastal Resilience Grant, Measure AA funding from the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, and other sources like that. We also looked at other local funding sources, which encompasses levying new taxes or assessments or something like that, which usually needs some sort of community approval or legislative approval. And then we also looked at a handful of opportunities for corporate and nonprofit donations to fund specific resilience infrastructure projects. So in addition to these pure funding sources, we also looked at a lot of local funding sources, which had opportunities for pure funding, pay-as-you-go revenue streams, but also the opportunity to finance on top of that. So for these sources, for instance, a Melrose district, you could create a Melrose district to issue a new assessment, which would be a pure funding source, or you could issue bonds backed by the revenue from that assessment, which would be more of a financing opportunity. So we looked at those opportunities, and then we looked at one opportunity, which is pretty significant, issuing general obligation bonds, which is the only opportunity for the county to simultaneously kind of marry a funding source with a dedicated financing opportunity. So in this case, issuing general obligation bonds backed by ad valorem property taxes for property owners. So what we wanted to do in our analysis was provide policymakers and project leaders with a really efficient method to evaluate all these funding sources and financing vehicles so they can best decide which sources are optimal for their different projects. So to do that, we provided the project leaders and policymakers with a list of 7 pieces of criteria. The 4 in circles are the 4 that we found to be the most salient in our decision to recommend or not recommend a source. And those are the ones that we ended up using in our ratings and scoring matrices, which Chelsea and Jackie will explain in a second. And those include eligibility, likelihood of funding, political feasibility, and amount of funding. So eligibility refers to whether or not a project is eligible to receive funding from a grant or other local funding source based on different aspects of the project or maybe project location and things like that. And that was rated on a likely or not likely basis. Likelihood of funding relates to the grant options, and that's measuring the likelihood that a specific project would receive funding from a specific grant program based on the grant's historic competitiveness, based on the similarity of that project to past projects that received funding from that grant program, and based on the list of prioritization factors released by the grant program, which outline different factors of projects that make the project more likely to receive funding. Political feasibility refers to the difficulty of passing a specific funding or financing measure based on community vote or legislative vote. So for example, issuing a special tax which requires a 2/3 community vote majority would be rated lower on political feasibility because it's a harder threshold to reach. And then amount of funding represents the amount of funding that you could receive from a potential grant or tax or other funding opportunity relative to the size of the project. And the other three pieces of criteria that we looked at that we encourage policymakers and project leaders to look at are administrative feasibility, equity considerations, and timing. So.
And to illustrate how these criteria can be applied to actual projects when the county decides to actually pursue certain mitigation factors for sea level rise and extreme rain, we decided to select 3 sample projects that were representative of the types of projects that the county might pursue in the future and apply these criteria to score different funding types for these projects. The first pictured is horizontal levees, the second is wetland restoration, and the third is green streets. So as Justin mentioned in our introduction, there were 2 types of climate change consequences that we're concerned with mitigating. The first is sea level rise, and the second is extreme rain. Under sea level rise, the county told us to specifically focus on protection projects. These are projects that specifically focus on mitigating areas that are considered at risk by implementing preventive measures. Within the county and nearby counties, there have been several projects under the protection phase, and they are essentially all types of barriers that differ in the way they're structured and what types of bodies of water they're designed for. We decided to focus specifically on horizontal levees and wetland restoration. A horizontal levee is similar to levees which the county has pursued in the past, except that they are designed by having vegetation on a slope. So compared to traditional levees, which are usually made of walls and more artificial materials, these are less disruptive and also more cost efficient. The second project, wetland restoration, involves enhancing current wetlands to give them more protection measures against sea level rise, but also habitat restoration. The second type of consequence we were concerned about is extreme rainfall. And within that, there's also 2 types of projects that are common. The first is diversion. This is a process of essentially taking stormwater and diverting it through some sort of engineered pathway and moving it to a different location. The second type is infiltration, and infiltration involves capturing stormwater at its source and then slowing it and filtering it within the groundwater. Within extreme rainfall, we focused on infiltration and decided on green streets. These are streets that are lined with vegetation that again capture stormwater and then filter it into the soil. So again, the 3 that we focused on were horizontal levee and wetland restorations for sea level rise, and then green streets for extreme rainfall events. And again, these 3 projects are projects that we thought were representative of the types of projects that the county might choose to pursue, based on the fact that they all have multiple co-benefits outside of directly addressing sea level rise, that they are cost efficient, and most of all, that they are seen currently as the most innovative technologies based on our research.
So now I'll discuss how we came up with the rating system that we use to rate each funding or financing source. So as Peter just discussed, there are 4 criteria that we deem to be the most important. And we created 9 matrices, each corresponding to the 3 phases of a project for the 3 projects that Jackie just introduced us to: horizontal levee, green streets, and wetland restoration. Now I'll start with eligibility. The rating criteria for eligibility is most straightforward. Likely indicates that the criteria for eligibility are met, but there could be some other factors of a project that could affect its eligibility. Not likely indicates that eligibility criteria are not met, and NA are not applicable means that there were no eligibility criteria that needed to be met. For likelihood of funding, this has a ranking of 1, 2, or 3, corresponding to low, medium, and high. As this criteria is only applicable to grants, the measure used for ranking was percentage of the applications selected for grant funding, and that's indicated here by the word chosen. Now for political feasibility, we use the same 1 to 3 scale, and as political feasibility is only applicable to non-grants, the measure used for ranking was percentage of the community that would have to vote in favor of the mechanism, and that's indicated here by the word vote. Finally, for amount, this is again utilizing our 1 to 3 scale, and the measure used for ranking was percentage of the project cost covered by the mechanism, and that's indicated here by the word cost. Our last category of other is a conglomerate of other factors that are selectively but not universally important to projects and to the viability of this source for any given project. We didn't create a formal quantitative ranking system for this, but instead utilize these considerations qualitatively as a means of adjusting the overall rating. We created the overall rating by averaging the value of the likelihood of funding or political feasibility category, depending on whether or not the source is a grant or non-grant, with the amount ranking. And as I just explained, these rankings were confirmed by looking at the other considerations. And now I'm just going to walk through a quick example of the calculation of our overall ratings. And as you can see with source 1, it has either a political feasibility or likelihood of funding rating of low and an amount rating of medium. The average value is 1.5, giving it an overall rating of low. Low ratings were those below 1.99 with no other factors that were considered to be compelling. No sources with an overall rating of low were considered in our final ratings matrices. This same logic applies for source 2 and 3 with overall ratings of medium and high respectively, given that no other factors for these sources were considered to be compelling enough to alter that raw rating.
And as introduced earlier, the next step that we're going to take is essentially walk you through a couple of these scoring matrices that we created for the 3 projects I mentioned earlier. Now, in our actual report for each project, we created a scorecard for 3 phases of each project, which we considered the main phases. This includes planning, construction, and then operations and maintenance. However, we noticed that there were the most funding sources available for construction phases of projects. So for purposes of this presentation, we're only displaying our ratings for construction. But in aggregate, this ratings methodology could be applied to any project in any stage that the county would pursue. So again, the first project that I touched on earlier was horizontal levees. So the first thing to notice about horizontal levees is that it's a pretty big project at a construction cost of $50 million. And in general, large projects like this are not sustainably funded by just grants, which is why our first recommended source, the general obligation bond, is a non-grant option. And for all these scoring cards, we only listed options that have a likely under eligibility because it doesn't make sense to consider options that are unlikely. And notice for general obligation bond, we have low for political feasibility and did not use likelihood of funding because it is a non-grant option. We gave it a low because a 2/3 community vote is historically very hard to come by. And we gave it a high, a score of 3 for amount, because it ranges from 50 million to 100 million, which is on the very high end for non-grant measures. As a result, by averaging the low and medium, we come to an overall rating of medium for general obligation bonds. And then our second option, Belarus bonds, are also a non-grant option. We give it a medium for political feasibility, given that it is a 2/3 property owner and developer vote rather than a community vote, which is easier to come by. And we give it a medium for amount because given that it's parcel-based rather than a formal property tax, it is historically known for producing a less amount of money than for something like general obligation bonds. As a result, that also gets us a score of a medium. The third is our only grant option that we feature on this specific scorecard. It is the San Francisco Restoration Bay Authority, and it was passed last year in 2016 as the Measure AA parcel tax. So it is essentially a 9-county, it's designated for 9 counties for San Francisco restoration for the San Francisco Bay restoration, excuse me. And in general, for likelihood of funding, we gave it a medium because although this project very closely matches the prioritization factors of this program, this is also anticipated to have a lot of applicants, and we don't currently have historical data for this specific grant program. Under amount, we gave this a low because although the average amount estimated is 2.5 million to 5 million, if you again take into consideration this huge size of $50 million, this is actually a very small percentage. So as a result, this grant is given a low. The second project that we want to cover is wetland restoration, again, the construction phase. And the first thing to notice here is it's much smaller than the horizontal levee at $3 million. So for this, we actually feature 3 grant measures and no non-grant measures. So again, notice that the San Francisco Restoration Bay Authority is featured here, and it has the same rating for political feasibility, but then a high rating for amount, and this is because 2.5 million to 5 million is a huge chunk if you're considering just a $3 million project. So as a result, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority rates high here. The second is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Wetland Restoration, and similar to the San Francisco Restoration Bay Authority, it rates a medium for likelihood of funding, given that we don't have historical data on it yet, and a high for amount, given that it's a significant chunk of 3 million, giving it a final rating of high. The third is the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund, another grant which we rate a medium for likelihood of funding. We, again, don't have historical data on the selection percentage, but we know that they are specifically looking to give 9 grants in the Bay Area. And again, the amount is medium because it's slightly smaller than the other 2 we mentioned, giving an overall rating of medium. The last example we want to go through is Green Streets construction as an extreme rainfall project. And for Green Street construction, one thing to call out is that all the ones we featured here have an overall rating of high. The first is local transportation funds. This is a non-grant option. Collectively, through vehicle license taxes and gasoline taxes and various other transportation types of taxes, this raises about $20 million, above $20 million per year. And under political feasibility, we give this a high because it requires just legislative approval rather than any sort of community or majority vote. And in terms of amount, historically, local transportation funds have given just several $100,000 to Green Streets projects in this area, giving it a medium. And then for the second option, it is again a non-grant option. It is a stormwater utility fee that allows utility fees for households to be used for stormwater-related projects. This is a high for political feasibility, given that it doesn't require a community vote, and a high for amount, given that it's in the multi-million-dollar range. And last, we have the Stormwater Grant Program. It is a medium for likelihood of funding, given a 32% selection rate out of applicants, and then a high amount, given a $4 million average award. So again, for all these, we give a high, and overall, we hope that the county is able to employ a similar approach once they have their projects that we did with these sample projects to apply their scorecard.
Thanks, Jackie. So, as mentioned before, we have 2 separate sets of recommendations. One being on the project developer side and the other one being on the policymaker side. So, jumping into recommendations that we have for project planners, looking more at the funding and financing menus that we had created, we have about 5 ideas for the county to take into consideration. So, the first one being planning and designing multi-benefit projects. So, with the key buzzword there being co-benefits. So, looking at one of our project type examples, horizontal levee. So, as mentioned before, it takes into consideration a traditional levee, but also adds the idea of wetlands restoration. So, we think that this can be applied to multiple different grants and increase the likelihood of funding for projects with co-benefits in mind. In addition to that, just having the county be in mind that multiple sources of funding will most likely be necessary for any project. Looking again at the horizontal levee with a $50 million estimated construction fee, it is very clear that there will need to be multiple grants or other options to consider to completely fund or finance these projects. In addition to that, the general fund, just letting the county know that this might be important for now more or less to kickstart or immediately plan a lot of these projects and types that the county should consider. Although the general fund is not something that you always want to tap into, we feel like it might be necessary to kind of kickstart projects. Another idea that we had, another recommendation, is just to kind of keep the county in mind that grant funding, historically, we have seen has gone more frequently to those who put a lot of effort into the construction phase. So whether that's being very detailed through the application in that construction phase process, we feel that should be kind of in the back of the county's mind when creating projects. Finally, just being opportunistic and keeping an open mind for atypical sources of revenue. One example for that, Safer Bay and Facebook kind of partnered up. Safer Bay approached Facebook and let them know the possible consequences of these, of stormwater and of sea level rises. And Facebook, in lieu, basically paid them to help build something that would keep Facebook's campus safe. So just kind of keeping with the idea of atypical funding sources. Our second set of recommendations is for the policymakers. So with the first one, we've heard a lot highlighted before, having stormwater property related fees. And so the one I'd like to highlight more, Jackie mentioned a little bit earlier, Senate Bill 231. We would like to kind of put an asterisk by that, and that it is currently in legal battles. But the importance of that is that typically there is a 55% property owner vote to pass and increase the fee that is currently there. However, with Senate Bill 231, there is no fee. So we believe that this could increase the likelihood that we would be able to raise the residential fee, which is currently at $14 a month. Other counties and other opportunities have been seeing this. It has raised multi-millions of dollars in the past. In addition to that, working to increase Measure AA of the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority parcel tax. This did rate well throughout most of our matrices. We think that it could be a popular source of revenue and be very likely to be funded with a lot of different projects or policies that we could develop. And then finally, just all of the ballots and whatnot start with educating the voters. So we've seen kind of two ideas from our interviews and from other resiliency projects and from other ideas that kind of worked for them. They highlighted educating the voters on co-benefits and cost avoidance. So whether or not just highlighting to them that if they approve of this bill or increase this, and immediately once we propose it, then it will be more beneficial in the future. But as all of these bills went on policy agendas, we believe it starts first with the voters, and we believe that the county should realize that that is very important in that sense. And then wrapping it up, we'd like to thank a lot of individuals who put a lot of time into helping us with our projects, starting first with San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, highlighting, of course, Jacqueline Sharma, who was our kind of point person, our liaison between the county and us. Other members of the county that took time out of their days to help us and guide us through when we met with them. Other individuals, experts in their fields, who we called to educate us on the different projects that they were doing to help complete our funding and financing matrices and recommendations. And then, of course, you guys, the Stanford University Public Policy Department and personnel, just for giving us this opportunity to go through this project and give us a little glimpse into local government, because without you guys, we would not have this opportunity. So we'd like to thank you all for coming today. We encourage you to look at our final report once it's completed. Maybe if you guys also want to take a peek at the complete general descriptive matrix that we have created, we'd be happy to send that out. But again, thank you all for coming, and we open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Can I start with a science question?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is about policy and about policy responses, but, and maybe you've covered this in your report, but I didn't see climate science here. And what I meant by that is, you know, in order to evaluate projects and, you know, to do that effectively, you have to have some sense of what sea level rise is going to be over what time period, what sort of, you know, rainfall levels are going to occur over what time period and so forth. Did you discuss that, or will that be in your report, or if not, how did you decide what to? How did you pick those
Yeah.
data points?
Yeah, so I think that was actually given to us by the county. So one of the very first things we read when we went into the project was a vulnerability report. It was like, I remember it was like a daunting reading. It was like 90 pages. So it was based on a lot of research they'd already done. And because of that, they narrowed our focus into the specific projects and types that we mentioned in this project.
Also, Joe, you have to remember that there's a broader conspiracy here. So we have engineering groups that are in the Sustainable Urban Systems class,
Okay.
and their presentations are precisely about that. So they're going to hear both groups. And what they've done is taken the projections of sea level rise and the flooding areas, and they've looked at what the likely environmental engineering damage to the buildings will be, and then projected out costs from that.
Yeah.
So I think the way we divided up the labor is more why they're not in the climate science
Yeah.
department.
And also, as Jackie was saying, just emphasize, I mean, the county just recently spent several $1 million on a scientific study called the San Mateo County Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Study.
Okay.
It has a lot of projections and a lot of science about the potential ranges and timing
I mean,
of
you
sea
guys-
level
I
rise.
was just curious, do you recall what those numbers are, anybody, or I'm just curious what you're working with?
The numbers.
Yeah,
Like the 2050 and the 2100.
Yeah, by 2050 or
Yeah.
2100, is it
Yeah.
11.7 inches, or is it 3 inches, or is it 3 feet, or, I guess I'm just curious.
Well, there are different scenarios.
There's
and
21 inches.
is the answer. And some of it
Probably
depends
not.
I think the model,
I
like
think
what
it's like
happens
one
to the
and three.
ice in Antarctica.
Sure.
So, but yeah, they're
2050,
talking
one
about
foot by
at
2050,
least 1 to
at
3
least
inches.
3 feet.
1 to 3 feet.
Yeah,
Jessica.
a foot by, well, you guys.
Yeah, I think
I think it was like 21 or 22 inches by 2100.
Got it.
But the other dynamic of this, which we're not going to capture this year, but it's a really important one, is if San Mateo goes ahead and builds either levees or the horizontal levees, that's going to deflect, if they act unilaterally, that's going to deflect the water to different parts of the bay and
Right.
exacerbate the sea level rise there.
Gotta be the
So we are participating in potentially a problematic exercise here if we encourage San Mateo to act by themselves. But nonetheless, you got to start somewhere.
And that's something that we also were taking into account with the Office of Sustainability, because they emphasize the need to pursue multi-jurisdictional funding sources and financing opportunities because of the multi-jurisdictional nature of the problem at hand. And so we didn't really touch on that in the presentation, but in our ratings, matrices, and our analyses, we talked a little bit about specific multi-jurisdictional funding sources and opportunities for partnering with other.
And why don't you mention like how that manifested itself on the construction
Yeah,
side?
so on the horizontal levee construction side, slide for example, we talk about 2 different bond opportunities. One is a geo bond, which we haven't yet figured out how that can be done on a multi-jurisdictional basis, because generally bonds are issued by a specific county or city, which would be a single jurisdiction. But issuing a Belarus bond, or there are other types of kind of creative jurisdictions, for a more like layman's term, that we talk a lot about in our funding sources, which can be created kind of regardless of county or city jurisdictions based on a set number of houses with a couple other eligibility requirements. So that's an opportunity for multi-jurisdictional financing.
So this horizontal levee is for just the San Mateo interior